Tanks are great for a lot of reasons, but mainly because they're really good at blowing things up. But somehow, during World War II, the Soviets had created a weapon system that was almost as good at causing havoc, the Katyusha. This vehicle would sling unguided rockets from these rails on top, saturating an area with a huge amount of high explosives in a short period of time. America thought this was a very good idea indeed, but they wanted to add it to their tanks. The T34 Calliope is the one everyone talks about, but there were 3 other serious attempts during the war that have mostly faded into the history books. All were ambitious, some were impressive, and one looks like it just needs put down. These are the American rocket tanks of the Second World War. The USA was no stranger to unguided rockets, even in the early years of the war. In fact, evidence shows that the Americans have been researching rocket technology at the Aberdeen Proving Ground as early as 1932, although they weren't convinced until far later, when the British would introduce their own successful rocket designs. The nations would share most of their technology during the war, and the US started developing their own rocket in 1941. This rocket, known as the M8, would be a 4.5-inch fin-stabilised design. The 4.5-inch diameter came about due to the fact that the earliest prototypes would use the casings of old fire extinguishers, which just happened to be that size. The M8 was intended to be primarily mounted on aircraft as an air-to-ground weapon. After an M8 was successfully launched from a P40 in July 1942, the Ordnance Department ordered 600,000 units of the weapon. Clearly there was some excitement about the design. Which made sense. The M8 had the same explosive yield as a 105mm artillery shell and had a maximum range of nearly 4 kilometers. The rocket was fin-stabilised. This meant that it worked fine from an aircraft, which was already moving at a significant speed. However, when fired from the ground, i.e. from zero velocity, the fins had very little effect in the first few seconds of flight as the rocket accelerated. This meant that there was a pretty significant wobble as it launched, completely eliminating any chance of accurate fire. The Army solved this by simply designating the M8 rocket a barrage weapon, and while an aircraft might fire the M8 one or maybe 2 at a time, the Army would fire them, as per the name, in barrages, putting huge amount of rockets downrange at once. It was certainly one way to solve that issue. Naturally, the next step was to mount it on a tank, and of course, it was going to be the M4 Sherman. The 60-tube T34 Calliope launcher was chosen, named after the strange steam-powered musical instrument. The launcher was mounted on top of a relatively unmodified Sherman, with large supports extending down and attaching to the sides of the Sherman's turret. The launcher was aimed using the main gun, as the two were mechanically linked. An arm was attached to a split ring around the 75mm gun, which meant as the gun elevated, so did the launcher. This gave it 25 degrees of elevation and 12 of depression, the same as the Sherman, but made the 75mm gun inoperable, as the recoil of the gun would either snap the support arm and render the launcher useless, or prevent the 75 from going into recoil altogether. The rockets were fired electronically by the commander from inside the tank, with cables extending down from the launch tubes through his hatch. The Calliopes were originally envisioned to support D-Day landings, slinging 4.5-inch high-explosive rockets at the German defences, but this was abandoned. The Calliopes were very top-heavy when fully loaded, so it made them a bit unsteady on a landing ship. Instead, they were going to support pushes by the infantry, with 30 Calliopes ready for action in December of 1944. This too was abandoned when German troops punched through the Ardennes in the Battle of the Bulge, and meant that the launchers weren't used in combat until March 1945. Its effectiveness as an artillery piece was questionable, but the psychological effect on enemy soldiers was not. The unmistakable sound of 60 4.5-inch rockets coming your way would certainly have an effect. But 4.5 inches, as we all know, is slightly below average. America wanted more firepower and turned to a 7.2-inch demolition rocket, the T-37, which had been developed from naval anti-submarine rocket known as the Mousetrap, which itself had been developed from the British Hedgehog mortar system. The issue with T-37 was that it was heavy, and so only had a range of about 210 metres, which, for a rocket filled with 14.5 kilograms of plastic explosive, was a little too close for comfort. They solved this with the T-57, which was a T-37 with the rocket engine of the M8 slapped onto the bottom of it. This extended the range to around 1,000 metres, which was deemed acceptable, and work commenced on a launcher for these weapons. This would evolve into the T40 Whizbang, which housed 20 of these rockets in a box launcher sat atop the M4 Sherman. The launcher was well protected, with hydraulically closing frontal doors and half an inch of armour all around. After all, you didn't want these rockets to be detonated by incoming fire, with nearly 300 kilograms of high explosives sitting less than a metre above the M4's turret. It was mounted and attached to the Sherman in much the same way as the Calliope, with the gun barrel and turret doing all the aiming. The Whizbang wasn't ready for D-Day and saw only very minor use before the war ended. Crews actually preferred the longer range of the 4.5-inch rockets, and some Whizbang launchers, like this one, were retrofitted with a series of 4.5-inch launch tubes taken from aircraft, with this specific example mounting 54 rockets. Like I mentioned in my M5 Stuart video, there was an attempt to mount the Whizbang launcher on the M5, but presumably the size, weight and armour of the M5 made it a less than ideal proposition. The T34 and T40 were for slightly longer range engagements. In November 1944, the US Army began work on a different sort of vehicle, known initially as the Engineer Armoured Vehicle T2. The vehicle's hull would be a modified M4A3 Sherman, with the floor thickened to 38mm in order to help survive mine blasts, and with dozer-compatible HVSS bogies. A flamethrower was added to the co-driver's hatch, who also had the standard 30 caliber bow machine gun to play with. However, the turret is where the real fun begins. This brand new turret would mount two 7.2-inch rocket launchers, a dummy 75mm gun, two 30 caliber coaxials, and a 50 caliber up top. The T94 rocket launchers were mounted in two pods either side of the central turret, with each pod carrying 5 rockets in a revolver type design. Each launcher could elevate up and down to aim the rockets at whatever was unfortunate enough to be in the vehicle's way, and were controlled by the gunner in the turret. The tank carried 2 reload drums for each rocket pod, with 30 rockets total. The vehicle, mounting 2 rocket launchers, 3 30 calibers, a 50 caliber and a flamethrower, was known as the T31, and work began in April 1945, just before the end of the war. When the prototype was completed in August and sent for testing, it proved to have serious issues. The revolvers had a nasty tendency to completely freeze up, while the hydraulic elevation mechanism would fail, forcing the crew to hand crank the launchers. By this point, the war was over anyway, so putting more effort into an M4 based demolition vehicle seemed a waste, and the T31 was cancelled in 1946. Shockingly, knowing the Americans, the M4 wasn't the only vehicle to mount rocket launchers by the end of the war. A new platform had emerged in 1944, the M26 Pershing, then considered a heavy tank. Crews had complained about the Calliope and Whizbang launchers making the turret difficult to get in and out of, which could prove potentially fatal if the tank was hit. The M26 rocket tank would solve this issue, mounting 2 T99 launchers on each side of the turret. The launchers would each house 22 4.5-inch rockets, the same as that on the Calliope, and would mount them independent of the 90mm main gun, being linked to the mantlet instead. This allowed both to be used simultaneously, which is a huge boost to firepower. The M26 T99 prototype, of which only one was ever built, was not completed before the end of the war, with testing only commencing in December of 1945. Very little is known about the fate of this vehicle or the performance of the T99 launchers, and it's assumed that the vehicle was deemed surplus to requirements after testing was complete, with none entering service and the vehicle likely modified back to M26 standard. Although no other tank-mounted rocket launcher systems would enter service with the US Army during the war, the concept is still used today. The M270 MLRS has been in service since 1983 and still serves today in many armies across the world. It's a relatively cheap and cheerful way of sending some serious pain at someone you don't like very much. Thank you so much for watching. I'd like to thank my patrons and encourage you to like, subscribe and check out my other content if you enjoyed this video. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one.